Hi everyone, this video lecture is about fieldwork, research methods, and research ethics. So if in the last video lecture we were really talking about what cultural anthropology is, in this video lecture I really want to talk about how cultural anthropologists do the work that they do. That is, what are the techniques that cultural anthropologists use to collect and present information about the subjects that we study. So that's what we're going to be talking about right now. So the readings you've done have already used this word fieldwork to describe the primary approach to collecting data that cultural anthropologists use. And what's distinctive about the fieldwork that cultural anthropologists do is that we locate ourselves in a community that we want to learn about. So unlike other social sciences that might, for example, invite people into a lab space, anthropologists go to where people actually live their everyday lives and spend often extended time in that world, in that cultural space, learning how people do things and hearing about their everyday lives. Our field sites then are communities where people live. They may be rural or urban. They may be in the U.S. or somewhere else. Historically, anthropologists worked outside of the U.S. and Europe, in non-Western cultural worlds. But in fact, in sort of today's anthropology, you can find cultural anthropologists working everywhere in the world, including right here in Chicago, for example. In those field sites, right, in the course of field work, anthropologists employ ethnographic methods. What that means is really trying to understand everyday life from the perspective of the people who live it. Participating in what people do, having ongoing conversations with people about how they view their worlds, how they understand the everyday practices that they engage in. And what that means is employing sort of two kinds of perspectives, or trying to understand two kinds of perspectives. And these are terms that show up in your readings as well. An emic and an etic perspective. What we mean by emic and etic is roughly a sort of insider perspective and an outsider perspective. It's more complicated than that makes it sound, but the idea is the emic perspective or insider perspective that the anthropologist wants to try to understand is how people living in a particular cultural world understand that world themselves, right? So what is sort of the local view of how things work, what makes things meaningful, why people do the things that they do. Anthropologists are sometimes already insiders, so to speak, right? So, for example, some anthropologists are studying in a community that they themselves are from. But more commonly, anthropologists did not grow up in the cultural world that they're interested in learning about. So they are bringing to that world more of an etic or outsider perspective. So the idea with cultural anthropological fieldwork is to sort of bring both of those perspectives into play, trying to understand everyday life from the perspective of the people who live it, right, the people who live in that space, while also trying to understand that cultural world from a sort of anthropological viewpoint, in a comparative way, in the broader scheme of human culture everywhere. And it's that duality, that sort of insider and outsider duality, that I think makes the research that anthropologists do particularly rich. The other key term that I'll bring in here is holism. So anthropologists typically focus on one aspect or a narrower sort of range of issues in the field sites where they work, right? So an anthropologist is not going to go to a community and just study sort of everything. So, for example, some anthropologists focus on religion, others focus on the economy or work, others focus on politics and power, right? But even as anthropologists will focus on a particular issue, we bring to that study an approach of holism, which means understanding that all of those things are connected. So wanting to take that topic and put it in context. and have a sort of well-rounded, multi-perspective view of life in that community. So if you're interested in studying politics and power, that doesn't mean you're only going to spend time around community leaders, right? Because you're going to understand that politics and power are connected to all kinds of other things. So that approach of holism is also really important to the work that anthropologists do. You've learned about the work of a particular pioneering cultural anthropologist, Margaret Mead, who's pictured here on the left-hand corner, lower left-hand corner of this slide. The film The Anthropologist that you're reading in this unit is partly about her work. And Margaret Mead's work in Samoa is an example of that sort of classic cultural anthropology fieldwork, where she embedded herself in a community outside of the U.S. and sort of tried to learn from people there about everyday life. But again, anthropologists today are not limited to just that kind of non-Western rural field site. So the book cover on the right then is an example of anthropologists working on life in the contemporary United States and in cities. So again, the full range of cultural worlds is included in the spaces that anthropologists work. Okay, so let's get a little bit more specific then about what anthropologists actually do from day to day during the time that they are doing field work in a particular cultural world or community. So anthropologists are social scientists, so we're interested in understanding how humans live in groups, but we're also employing qualitative methods. So unlike some other social sciences that lean heavily, for example, on statistical approaches, anthropologists are more interested in talking to people and observing everyday life and collecting the narratives or stories that derive from those kinds of interactions, okay? So anthropologists typically, during their field research, will employ multiple methods, and two that are especially important, that I'll talk about a little bit more in a second, are interviews, right, which are those sort of guided conversations that we have with often many, many people in the course of field research, and observation, which is, again, being attentive to what is going on in daily life and recording it in some way, often simply by taking notes about it, sometimes by taking video or photography. But interviewing and observation are cornerstones of that ethnographic field research that anthropologists engage in. Now, anytime one does research, particularly research that involves other human beings, there are all kinds of ethical considerations that arise. When you're interacting with other people and essentially asking them to participate in your research project, one needs to be really attentive to what the implications are of that for those participants, and make sure that people are well cared for, right? That people's well-being, both obviously physical but also emotional and psychological, is first and foremost in one's mind as one interacts with people. So there are all kinds of ethical issues. So as we're trying to employ those research methods, talking to people, observing people, living with people, spending time there, all of those things, we're also making sure that we're conducting that research in an ethical way. And there are very specific guidelines that cultural anthropologists follow to make sure that we are indeed proceeding in an ethical way. So we're going to talk about both of those things, those specific methods and the ethics involved. So I already mentioned that interviewing and observation are key elements of the kind of research that cultural anthropologists do. That's not the only techniques that we use. So I've listed here some of the techniques that are most commonly used by cultural anthropologists. Observation and participant observation, which I can talk about in a second in terms of this sort of distinction there. Interviews that I've mentioned, which are really just sort of conversations with an agenda, right? Surveys are similar in certain ways to interviews. It's also about asking people questions and then analyzing their responses. But surveys are typically more regimented than interviews. Often they take the form of something that people fill out, either a paper version or an online version, and therefore they're more consistent from one to the next. But it's a similar technique to interviews. Anthropologists are often really interested in the history of the place that they are doing their field research. So document analysis is often something that we engage in as well. For example, visiting historical archives and looking at sort of what was going on in that place in the past. Mapping is another technique. Anthropologists, again, are all about sort of the context of what they're studying. So understanding the physical space or the way that a community is laid out is often important. Genealogies are a way of simply tracing familial relationships. The ways that people are related to one another often are important at multiple levels, not only for understanding the subject of family, but also for understanding how power is organized, how gender roles play out, etc. So again, figuring out family trees is another technique that we use. And photography and film, not all anthropologists use this, but is an important technique for capturing all that visual data. And some anthropologists, in fact, instead of producing written records of what they've learned, produce films. So it is another sort of tool in our toolkit that can be used depending on the circumstances. One of the things to understand about cultural anthropology, and one of the things that distinguishes it from some of the other social sciences, is that anthropologists, as I mentioned earlier, use a qualitative approach. A quantitative approach is one that processes information in a sort of numerical way, right? It wants to quantify or count what's going on. So, for example, social sciences like sociology and economics often employ statistical analyses, right? That's one lens for understanding what's going on in the world or in societies. Cultural anthropologists usually use a qualitative approach. That means not counting sort of the number of times people do things or the number of people who said a certain thing, but interpreting the stories and narratives that emerge from the research methods that we use. So, for example, if you interview 100 people, looking for the themes that emerge from those 100 conversations and trying to attach meaning to them, right? So that kind of qualitative approach is also a hallmark of the methods and approaches that cultural anthropologists use in their field research. So again, this, in terms of sort of locating cultural anthropology in the range of other fields, research fields that are out there, cultural anthropology is a social science, but it also borrows lots of techniques from the humanities. That puts us in kinship with approaches like history. That's sort of where to understand cultural anthropology's position in that broader range of fields. As you're learning in this course, anthropology also has subfields that locate themselves in the natural sciences, like biological anthropology. Cultural anthropology is always sort of relational. That is, trying to connect what we learn to other subfields and fields that may employ different techniques and different kinds of theoretical approaches than we do, right? But in terms of cultural anthropology itself, that's a qualitative social science. Okay, so breaking down even further the two key methods that I mentioned, I want to talk a little bit more about observation and interviewing. So observation, you've all done it, whether formally or informally, is simply paying attention to and recording what one can perceive of what's going on in a particular cultural world. I made a distinction on the last slide between observation and participant observation, so I want to talk about that for a minute. Participant observation has been one of the key approaches that anthropologists have used since the very beginning of the discipline. And participant observation is pretty much what it sounds like. One way to understand what participant observation is that it's learning through doing, right? So the idea is that we can learn a lot of things from watching people do things, but there's some other things that we can learn if we actually try to do those things ourselves, actually participate in the activity that we want to know about. So instead of just sitting on the sidelines and watching other people, you get up and actually try your hand at those things. That doesn't mean that anthropologists don't sometimes do observation that entails sitting on the sidelines, right? A more sort of detached kind of observation. So both methods are employed, or both techniques are employed. But participant observation, right, is especially important. If you think about the kind of field research that I've already described, where an anthropologist essentially moves into a community, it's hard not to do some amount of participating, right? Just in the course of everyday life, one is engaging in those activities, right? Simply by being there and by living in that place. And again, the idea that anthropology has is that there's something really valuable to be learned from actually trying your hand at the things that people in that place do, as opposed to just watching them yourself. You learn by actually physically participating in a way that you wouldn't learn as much if you were simply watching. Whether one is watching from the sidelines or participating oneself, observation is recorded typically in field notes, right? Which is either writing down, if you're in a place, for example, with no electricity, or typing into a Word document, right? What you are perceiving, what you are observing. So again, this is not just sort of casually watching, it's watching and trying to record that information so that one can actually reflect on it and analyze it. Interviewing, as I mentioned, is really just a conversation that is guided by researchers' interest in learning about certain things. And the kinds of interviews that anthropologists do in the course of field work take various forms. Some are more formal and some are more informal. So there are times when an anthropologist in the field will specifically ask someone to sit down and ask a series of questions in a sort of a more directed way. But there's also lots of just informal conversations that happen in the course of everyday field research. And all of those conversations and the answers that people provide are important to understanding what's going on. Likewise, some interviews will be more structured and some more unstructured. When I say structured, I mean interviews where the anthropologist will use a particular sequence of questions worded in a particular way in multiple interviews. So to establish a kind of consistency that allows for a particular view of what's going on. But there's also a place for more unstructured conversations. Cultural anthropologists, I think, first and foremost, understand that there's lots of things we simply don't know enough to even ask when we first go into a field site. So letting what emerges in interviews guide our subsequent work becomes very important. So in other words, an unstructured interview where you let the interviewee, to some extent, direct the conversation and direct you to subjects that are important to them becomes also very important. So that kind of more open-ended, in-depth interviewing that's more unstructured is also an important technique. And then there's lots of other sort of subcategories of interviews that we could talk about. Asking people to narrate their life histories is one technique that some anthropologists use. You can learn a lot by sort of eliciting a biographical narrative from people. We already mentioned genealogies. That can be a part of the interviewing process as well. Simply asking people to tell you sort of who they're related to and in what ways can be, again, a really interesting way to understand how a community is organized. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that anytime we're engaging with other people, there's all kinds of ethical issues that we need to attend to. Working with what in research is sometimes called human subjects, meaning simply other human beings, right, who we're going to be interacting with, asking questions of, observing, etc., demands that we are really clear on our ethical responsibilities. And anthropologists, like all other researchers, have a very sort of particular sense of what is ethically appropriate and ethically inappropriate behavior in field research. So just to sort of give you a sense of that, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about how one of the major organizations within anthropology, which is the American Anthropological Association, it's the major professional organization for anthropologists in the United States, how that organization approaches research ethics. So the AAA, like professional organizations for all the other fields out there, has a sort of set of guidelines for ethics that it maintains and revises. So the statement on ethics from the AAA is a good place to start in understanding what the ethical obligations are of cultural anthropologists in the field. So I'm going to share some of those items with you. So these are sort of 7 principles that the AAA puts forward as central to what it means to do ethical cultural anthropology research. So the first is do no harm, right? Which seems like it should go without saying, but again, understanding that when we introduce ourselves into a community or working with other human beings, that there are implications to what we do, that we have an effect on the people around us. So always understanding that first and foremost, we need to protect the well-being of those people and make sure that our behavior and our presence is not in any way causing harm or potential harm to the people around us. For number 2, which is, I think, related to that idea of making sure that we are in no way sort of engaging in behavior that could potentially be harmful, is being completely open and honest about who we are and what we're doing. So, for example, cultural anthropologists would never do sort of undercover research, right, where we pretend to be somebody other than who we are to get people to talk about things that they might not otherwise want to talk about. It's crucial that anthropologists from the very beginning say, hello, this is my name, this is the institution I'm from, I'm an anthropologist, I'm doing research, right? And here are the things I'm going to do with that research, right? Like I planned to collect information and I want to publish a book about it. People have the right to understand who you are because it's only if they know who you are that they can make a decision about whether they want to participate in the research or not. Likewise, having been honest about what we're doing, then there's an obligation to obtain informed consent. Informed consent is a concept that I'm sure you're familiar with. If you even go to a doctor's office, often you need to sign an informed consent form. And it's just what it sounds like. That is that, first of all, people need to be informed about what you're doing, right, and what their participation entails. And then once they know that, once they have that information, they need to actively consent to it or not, right? So anthropologists, again, engaging with people in the field, if we decide, for example, we want to invite somebody for an interview, there's an informed consent process that happens before we start that conversation where we say, and it's often very, very specific, where there's either some kind of form that somebody needs to read and sign, or you read a statement about informed consent and ask that person whether they're willing to participate. Where, again, you're clear about, here's who I am, here's why I'm doing this, here's how long this will take, here's whether there's any risk to you, etc. So that, again, people have the information they need so that they can make that decision, and then they make it, right? It's not just implied that people are willing to consent. They say, yes, we can do the interview, or no, I'd rather not, right? Number 4, I think, speaks to just how complicated research ethics are, that there are often conflicting or competing ethical obligations, right? Just to give sort of one example, often anthropologists protect the identity of the individuals who participate in the research by using something like a pseudonym or not using the name of the exact town we worked in, right? So that people can maintain that privacy. But there are other cases where somebody really wants their work to be recognized, right? What they're doing in their community. So then figuring out whether to include the actual name of someone becomes one of those competing obligations. There's an obligation to maintain the confidentiality of what people told you. There's also an obligation to recognize people and their work in the world. So there's always going to be complexity to making decisions about research ethics. It's not a cut and dried or one-size-fits-all sort of phenomenon. Number 5 is making the results of research accessible. One of the things that various researchers are sometimes accused of is elsewhere and not ever coming back to the community with the results or that publication. So making results accessible is another sort of ethical obligation that anthropologists have. There's also an obligation to protect the records that derive from that study. And protect them, meaning also keep them from falling into other people's hands, right? So it's not something where you pass around your interview notes to colleagues or friends. It's not that it's secret exactly, because we are going to publish, but it's that one needs to be purposeful and careful about in what settings and in what contexts that information is presented and how. And then finally, always maintaining respectful and ethical professional relationships, both in our institutions, for example, in the universities where we work, but also in the countries where we do field research. There's all kinds of other colleagues you work with. Often anthropologists have connections to the faculty at the university in the country where they're working, right? And maintaining those collegial relationships is also part of our ethical obligation, right? So maintaining a sort of network of people around our research and keeping that set of relationships in good repair. So the final little piece of this sort of discussion of how anthropologists do their work that I want to touch on is the results, the product that comes out of the process of doing research. So the written accounts of what we do in the field, of our research and our findings, are called ethnography. And for cultural anthropologists, that can take the form of articles, right, journal articles, which are sort of chapter length papers, or they can also take the form of books, right? So often cultural anthropologists will publish book-length accounts of what they learned through their field research. And those accounts are called ethnography. I want to talk about a couple of important qualities to the writing that cultural anthropologists publish. And that is multivocality and reflexivity, which are sort of fancy words for some of the primary ways that anthropologists try to do their writing. Multivocality means multiple voices are represented in the text. As we already learned earlier in this video, anthropologists do a lot of interviewing, right? And just having a lot of conversations with people, hearing people tell them stories about their lives. And anthropologists try to preserve that sense of conversations in the writing that we do. So ethnographies often include not only the voice of the anthropologist, but excerpts of the stories that we hear in the voices of other people. Including sort of direct quotes of people telling those stories, and more sort of understanding who the individuals are within a community and how they came to tell those stories. So that idea of multivocality means that the piece of writing has still multiple perspectives and multiple voices embedded in it. It's not just the story as told from the perspective of the cultural anthropologist. The cultural anthropologist's voice is in there too, but it's not the only voice. And that leads me to the idea of reflexivity. So the way that the cultural anthropologist's voice is represented in that text, in that ethnography, often takes the form of reflexivity. What reflexivity means is that the anthropologist includes in the narrative basically the story of what it was like to be present in that cultural space. So in other words, cultural anthropologists in our writing, we typically use the pronoun I, right? We say, I did this, I did that. And we include in the writing that we do sort of the story of doing the research, right? So I went here and people reacted in this way, and I had these conversations and people, said this or said that. So in other words, the anthropologist appears as essentially a character in the story that the ethnography is telling. The anthropologist writes their own experience and the fact of their own presence in the field site into what they publish in the ethnography. And that's the notion of reflexivity, right? So reflecting on the way that one's presence in the field site informed what happened and what one learned. Anthropologists consider that not something to apologize for, but something that's really part and parcel of the research project, right? The fact is, unlike some other kinds of research, anthropologists influence what's going on around them, right? We're not going in as somehow a sort of a fly on the wall. You are there, you are a human among other humans, and people are talking to you and reacting to you as another human, right? So in other words, cultural anthropologists are not invisible in their field sites, and therefore we shouldn't be invisible in the texts that we produce. That would be inaccurate, essentially, of what happened, right? So anthropologists write themselves into their ethnographies as a way of being transparent about the research process and understanding that, in fact, the ways that our presence influenced interactions can also be an important way to learn about that cultural world. So again, as you read the accounts of cultural anthropologists in the course of this class, you'll see examples of that multivocality and reflexivity, again, which are hallmarks of the writing that anthropologists produce. Okay, we'll close there and we'll talk again soon. Bye-bye.